Welcome to Meanwhile at the Museum, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes with the people, stories, and shenanigans that make Cincinnati Museum Center what it is. I'm Cody Hefner, and I'm joined today by Tyler Swinney, who is our NAGPRA manager and Tribal Liaison, which is a little bit of alphabet soup that some people, if you're in the museum field or if you work in this field, you may know. But I don't think if I tried, I could nail what NAGPRA stands for. So what do you do, and what does that mean?
Well, first of all, Cody, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And NAGPRA, you're right, it is a bit of alphabet soup. It's an acronym. It stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It's federal legislation that was passed in 1990, and it has three really interesting parts for me. First and foremost, it is human rights legislation. It is meant to address inequalities between museum officials, university officials, federal agencies, any institution that controls, stewards, curates Native American ancestral human remains or cultural objects. It's meant to level the playing field between those federally recognized tribal nations and the institutions that control those or steward those. The second part is that it has important implications for land use policy on federal land and tribal land. And then the third part is that it has implications for property law because of the way that those institutions own those materials.
When you said it goes back to 1990, or it was signed into law in 1990, I was shocked at how recent that is. That feels pretty recent, but not to get too deep into this because we will spend hours on it, but rights and protections and respect for indigenous groups and native groups in the United States is sort of a recent thing, and it's been a long struggle.
Well, for someone looking from the outside looking in, it may feel recent, but really it was way past due. NAGPRA is exceptionally important legislation, and it seems recent only because we're looking at it from our own lens. In the broader scheme of Native American rights and advocacy, just as an example, it wasn't until the 1970s that Native Americans were able to practice their own religions. It's an obviously disenfranchised group that has experienced a lot of forced policy upon them. And because of the removal from their ancestral lands in the eastern United States, the Midwest, and in other places, there are a lot of inequalities amongst the tribal nations and the lands that they currently live on today and their ancestral territories and the places that are on those ancestral territories in the Cincinnati area or Ohio in general. So
speaking of that, when you're talking about indigenous groups and Native people here in Cincinnati and in Ohio, the second part of your title, Tribal Liaison, how often are you speaking with individuals here locally versus somewhere out west in Oklahoma or elsewhere?
So there are no federally recognized tribes in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Indiana, there is one that is kind of on the border. That's the Pokagon Band of Potawatomis. They're the closest federally recognized tribe to the Cincinnati area. The next closest tribe would be the Seneca Nation of Indians in New York. They're based in Salamanca. But there are no tribes that are present in Ohio that have federal recognition. I manage relationships with about 20 different federally recognized tribes. Those tribes are primarily based today in Oklahoma. The vast majority of them are in Oklahoma, but there are a few in New York and a few in Michigan that we also maintain relationships with.
What are those conversations like? How are we managing that relationship, and what is the current relationship with those various tribes with the Museum Center?
Well, I'd say that there's varying degrees of the intensity of that relationship. Some tribes that have stronger connections to Ohio we work with on a much more regular basis. This would include, for instance, the Miami Nation of Oklahoma, the Shawnee Tribe, the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. These are all tribes that have very significant and strong connections to the Cincinnati area, as well as the Osage Nation and the Seneca Nation of Indians. Some of the more northern groups, for instance, like the Pokagon Band of Potawatomis, we maintain a pretty significant relationship with them, but it's not a tribe that has as strong of connections in the Cincinnati area as the aforementioned tribes do. There are also a lot of other tribes that have connections to our area, and it's based on time period. So some tribes were in our region for, hypothetically, let's say, during the late Archaic period, as they migrated from one area to the next. Other tribes have been here since the beginning, in time immemorial, while other tribes, while they were being removed from their ancestral territories on the East Coast, they moved to the Cincinnati region as part of the removal process. So although this area may not be their original ancestral territory, it is a part of the territories that they have had occupancy at different times, and it means that they have a vested interest in our region too. And the Delaware tribes are a very, very good example of that.
we can all probably name 3 or 4 Native individuals from history, but largely they're absent from history books, they're absent from the storytelling. So as part of your work as a tribal liaison, are you trying to pull more of those stories forward and give more voice to the different Native people who have lived in this region over time?
Oh, absolutely. Advocacy is a major part of my job as a whole. Obviously, working for a museum means that there's a significant public education component, and that could be in the form of exhibitions, in public outreach, and just in public archaeology or community outreach in general. So advocacy is a major important role, and I don't ever want to represent myself as speaking for any of the tribes that we work with. When a question comes to mind, I can always reach out to the appropriate community and ask for their feedback on how to respond to a specific question. Or I could also inform the person who's asking those questions. I can inform them of the appropriate people to contact so that they could get the correct information from the correct people.
When you ran us through NAGPRA and the acronym, part of that is repatriation of objects, of remains, things like that. What is our collection like in that regards, in terms of Native objects and Native artifacts, and how do we acquire them, and what's our policy with them now?
So it's important to note that museums have caused harm to Native communities. All museums that curate or steward any Native American objects in some way, shape, or form have most likely caused harm to Native peoples unless they have formed more recently in concert or collaboration with tribes. Our policy is full transparency. So my job is to inventory parts of the Museum Center's collections and to make the information available to the appropriate communities so that decisions can be made about the culturally appropriate care and management of those collection items, the maintenance of them. The Museum Center and all museums in Ohio are at a disadvantage when it comes to this, largely because there are no federally recognized tribes that are close to us. So there is definitely a logistic hurdle in doing this in the most expeditious way possible. The museum as a whole is committed to repatriation of all items that fall under the purview of NAGPRA, and those items would include ancestral Native American human remains, funerary objects, which can be subdivided into 2 categories: associated objects and unassociated objects, meaning that if they're associated, the ancestral remains that they're associated with are also curated by the same institution. Unassociated means that those have been separated at some point in time where the information has been lost. There are also sacred items. Sacred items could be a variety of different things, and that depends on the tribe itself, who is affiliated, or the group of tribes. In a lot of cases, we tend to silo tribes as individual groups, but in reality, the archaeological record and the ethnohistorical record of our region shows that there is a lot of ethnic diversity in our area, and that is largely attributable to the confluence of 5 major rivers in the Cincinnati area: the Ohio River, the Licking River, the Little Miami River, the Great Miami River, and the Miami Whitewater River. So all of these rivers join in one location, so there's people coming from every direction. The Ohio River is the main superhighway of the past, going from east to west in the Midwest. So it joins with the Mississippi River, which is obviously another major superhighway going north-south. So there's a lot of interactions that are occurring in the Cincinnati area that you don't necessarily see in other places that don't have as many overland transportation routes or a nexus of rivers confluencing all in one location. The final category of a NAGPRA item is what's called an object of cultural patrimony. Now, I am not qualified to make decisions about what an item of cultural patrimony is. These need to be identified by the appropriate communities, and specifically religious leaders within those communities. So that really goes to show the importance of collaborating with tribes, and this is through a process called consultation, which is open information sharing. And sometimes, I'm not going to lie, it requires tough skin to handle these types of relationships because, like I mentioned before, museums have caused tribes harm, and there's a lot of making up that needs to be done, and a lot of relationship building, which is not necessarily inherent. It's difficult to not only establish relationships, but as we've all learned over the last several years, where a lot of relationships were severed because of COVID closures and not being able to interact with some of our older friends and things like that. Relationships require maintenance on both sides and require investment on both sides. So a big part of my job is just reaching out and seeing how people are doing and continually sharing information to make sure that we can make the most informed decisions in the most respectful and culturally appropriate manner always.
I have to imagine that technology is helping in this in a way. I had a conversation recently about digitizing collections, and a lot of institutions have been collecting for 100 years, 200 years, and so you're a century or two behind the eight ball on doing that, on catching up. But in digitizing more and cataloging more, it makes it easier for these tribal groups to be able to identify objects, or to have a better sense of what's where, what's available, and to kind of track them more or less that they may not have in the past.
You're right, but there's two sides to that coin. There are definitely items that are in museum collections, not necessarily ours, but in museum collections as a whole, that should not be photographed. So that information is not as easy to transmit from one location to the other. I'd say that one of the biggest advances that we've had in the last several years is the adoption of remote consultation using different remote platforms like Zoom or Teams or WebEx. These are different ways that before COVID, it was always in person to do a consultation. And all of the main tribal groups that have connections to Cincinnati, either historically or during the pre-contact period, have met with us at our collection facility, the Geyer Collections and Research Center. The intent is to make sure that they're on site as much as possible whenever they're in the area. And it's always an open invitation to stop by if they're passing through Cincinnati, perhaps, for instance, for the Ohio Tribal Nations Conference by the Ohio History Connection, or if they're consulting with one of the other institutions in the Midwest that are where Cincinnati falls a part of that path. We also make trips to Oklahoma. So we have completed 2 intertribal consultation meetings in Oklahoma. And in each of these meetings, there have been several tribes that have participated. And we find that in these situations, it's very, very beneficial to have multiple tribes, as many tribes as possible, who are affiliated with a particular area in one place to make decisions collectively. Because the more people who can weigh in the decision-making process, the more likely that decision is going to stand overall.
A lot of your role sounds like, and I'm gathering, is consultation, is discussion, is relationship building. But I've seen you about neck deep in a hole in the ground. I've seen you, you have a screen, you have a hose, and you're just kind of sifting through bags and bags and bags and bags of dirt. So tell me a little bit about Tyler in the field. What are you doing when you're in the field, when you're on these digs, and how do you even know where to look?
So although my title is the NAGPRA Program Manager and Tribal Liaison, I wear a lot of additional hats.
It's usually a Cincinnati Reds hat.
Sometimes a Cincinnati Reds hat, sometimes a Cincinnati Bengals hat, sometimes a University of Cincinnati hat. Cincinnati sports are near and dear to my heart, so I am a big fan of our local teams.
Are you homegrown? Are you?
I am.
Cincinnati?
I'm a first-generation Cincinnati, and my family is entirely from Kentucky, almost exclusively from the Louisville area, and I'm a first-generation Cincinnati, and so I embrace that part of my identity very much so, and especially when it comes to my allegiances to specific teams. But I am a trained archaeologist. My background is in ethnohistory, Midwestern archaeology, geoarchaeology, and very specifically as a museum archaeologist, it does require processing of older excavated collections, and the Museum Center did run multiple field schools at a site here in the Cincinnati area called the Hahn site, which is located about 9 miles east of Cincinnati in Anderson Township. So this is a site that the Museum Center worked at from, I believe, started in 2008 and completing in 2019. And we're still in the process of processing that material. So what you're describing is 2 different things. Processing soil flotation samples. This is the extraction of botanical material. Usually it's been carbonized, so it's been exposed to heat.
So plants, yeah. Right? Yeah.
Removing plant material from soil samples. And I should clarify too, in these excavations, we were exclusively focusing on domestic architecture, so structures. We're exclusively focusing on that in a broader scheme of looking at a specific site that had never been professionally excavated to understand aspects of site occupational history, material culture, interaction networks to the north, south, east, and west, and the strongest connections appear to be the west based on the material culture items that we see at that site. I'm very interested in something called formation processes, and especially in a smaller niche version called discard. So discard processes, what people did with their trash in the past. So we focus on what are called pit features, and pit features are holes that are dug in the ground. These holes may have served an initial function as maybe an oven, like an earth oven. They might have been dug to acquire raw materials such as gravel, sand, flint, clay. So in this case, they're dug to acquire something. But more often than not, what they're used for, so this site, the Hahnfield site, is a site that dates primarily to the Middle and Late Fort Ancient periods. Fort Ancient is a archaeologically constructed term that references the period from 1000 current era to about 1650 current era. So a time span of about 650 years. And this time period is associated with three really important developments. One is the introduction of maize agriculture into our region. Two is the consolidation into these fairly large villages, so sedentary maize agriculturalists who are living in permanent houses that are made from wattle and daub. And then the third is the introduction of new technologies. So specifically, the bow and arrow shows up around this time, around 1000 CE, current era, and then the adoption of shell as a tempering mechanism in pottery. Temper in pottery, for those of you who may not know, is a material that's added to the clay paste in order to make it more resistant to breakage, and it also makes the vessel stronger. So crushed, thermally modified, freshwater bivalve mussels are the strongest and most durable of all of the tempering mechanisms that are used in the Midwest at any point in time. So there's a lot that's going on in this region, and this culture, the Fort Ancient culture, which, to point out and to be completely honest, I don't like the term Fort Ancient because not only is it a time period, but it is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Ohio, in Warren County. Great place. I encourage everyone who listens to this to absolutely visit it. The folks at the Ohio Street Connection and at the National Park Service did a wonderful job in getting 8 sites designated as the 28th UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the United States, and they're all in Ohio. But Fort Ancient can be misleading as a culture. It's a construct. It's a term that archaeologists made to refer to people in the past. Well, one, the people that created these sites, they still exist. The Fort Ancient culture is ancestral Shawnee, ancestral Miami, and then probably a host of several other tribes like the Peoria, to a lesser extent maybe the Seneca, potentially even the Osage may have had connections to this area. So the site is very interesting, but the terminology could be better, and we see that a lot when it comes to North American archaeology because it is white, predominantly male archaeologists who define these terms, usually Western terms, to reference non-Western people, Native North Americans.
So in looking at these sites, how do you even... You mentioned the rivers, you mentioned the confluence, which, you know, these are major trade routes, transportation routes for groups. But how do you know to dig there? How do you know to look at the Han site? Are you using a metal detector and walking around and just waiting for something to turn up? Are you guessing? Because you see it represented a lot, and maybe not so much movies, probably more cartoons. You probably see Bugs Bunny doing a lot of this, but are you just stabbing in the ground and hoping to turn something up?
No, what differentiates archaeologists from looters or collectors is the systematic excavation and the prospecting, the identification of cultural resources that warrant investigation. So the Han site is a great example of a site that has been known since at least the 1870s. It was excavated by the Peabody Museum at Harvard University for a very short period of time in 1885. So we've known its location since at least the 1870s. We know that the site had been partially excavated over a 45-day period in 1885 by Harvard. But today, we would never open up the types of blocks that they worked on. I mean, these were enormous units that they were excavating. Today, we focus on specific features of interest. A feature is a cultural deposit, too, so that is a part of the archaeological lingo. We use a technique called remote sensing, and there are a variety of different forms of remote sensing. The earliest ways that archaeologists were employing remote sensing was through aerial photography. Today, things like LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging, can measure subtle variations on the surface and see areas that have been built up anthropogenically by people. Anthropogenically means that it has been built by people or modified by people. At this site, and most other sites in the area, one of the most useful tools is a method called magnetometry, and very specifically a type called gradiometry, which uses dual magnetometers and then measures the variance in between the two. I know that this sounds really complicated, but essentially think of two very powerful magnets that are going across the surface of the Earth and that are measuring subtle variations in the magnetic field below ground.
Is it kind of like taking an ultrasound of the ground, or
It's a
sonar
little
in a
bit like
way?
that. It's more like an ultrasound, I guess, than sonar. And it's more like an MRI, really, than either of those two because it's using magnetic fields. Basically, the way that it works is that anytime that you dig a hole in the ground, today or in the past, you can't put that material back in the hole in the same way. So it will register a disturbance. That disturbance could be thousands of years old. It could be days old in cases. The disturbance, and this gets back to the type of material that are in the pits that we're usually focusing on. These pits are filled with domestic and habitational refuse. A lot of this material has been thermally altered because of cooking, because it includes pottery, which has been fired, which is sub-bisque pottery. It's fired on the surface. It's not fired in kilns like today. So it's not as hard as modern pottery would be. But with certain types of treatment, it could certainly withstand immense heat. It could be used for cooking. It can hold water if it's been treated correctly with a slip or even with like fat on the inside of or the outside of a vessel to keep it so that it's not percolating through the walls. But because these disturbances in the past, these holes dug in the past, have trash in it, refuse in it that has been thermally modified, when something is burned, it elevates its magnetism. So they show up as very obvious anomalies with respect to the background magnetism of the entire area.
There's always those really bad TV shows of private investigators and stuff, and they're picking through people's trash, and it's because there's something they can find, a letter, they can find a bill, they can find something that tells them something about what that person did. There's a lot of information to be gained in looking at what people threw out because they're discarding parts of food and they're discarding broken pottery, things like that. What are you looking for, and how readily are you able to discern what that's telling you?
So one thing that differentiates modern archaeologists versus archaeologists from the 1800s is that today we're much more focused in understanding people, specifically their life ways, what they hunted, what they collected, the tools that they made, modifications that they made in cutting bone, what types of things that they're making and what they're discarding. It's a really strong insight into the day-to-day activities that go on in a domestic area, a village, or a house. In the past, archaeologists were much more focused on objects. So objects that they could display, or unfortunately, in some cases, they could commoditize or sell. The commoditization of indigenous objects is something that I certainly don't support. But when it comes to domestic refuse in the materials that are being produced in the day-to-day production of food, the day-to-day production of tools, the day-to-day production of pottery, and then how that's discarded, understanding where, why, and how, one, it was made, and then what was done to discard it is of interest to me. These are human-caused formation processes. So I mentioned formation processes earlier. There are two really broad groups of formation processes. There are cultural or anthropogenic formation processes, which are ones that are created by people. So something that a person had to do in order to make that process happen, like discard. And then there are environmental formation processes. This could be maybe a piece of pottery sits on the surface for decades before it's finally collected up and thrown out into a refuse-filled pit. It might have registered abrasion from wind, or it might be cracked and broken because of freezing and thawing. When moisture got into a crack into it, it froze and it thawed, and it froze and it thawed, and it broke into certain types of patterns that can be identifiable as environmental formation processes. The same thing would occur if there were, a slight flood. When things get buried by those types of processes, those are environmental processes rather than cultural formation processes. And understanding variability in the past with how the archaeological record forms is one of my primary interests. And I specifically am interested in zoo archaeology, so the study of animal bones, and then pottery is an I'm interested in a little bit of everything, to be honest. It's one of, I guess, if I wear a lot of hats for the museum, my archaeological interests also have lots of different hats too.
Where did that start for you? When did you say archaeology is for me? This is the path I want to go. To even be interested in what you can learn in that way.
Well, believe it or not, when I started college way back in 2004, I was a marketing and advertising major. And it only took micro and macroeconomics in the same semester for me to realize that I was not going to be a marketing and advertising major.
That's fair.
I was very fortunate. I went to Western Kentucky for the beginning of my undergrad, and I was very fortunate while I was there to meet a professor And she's no longer at Western anymore, but I met a professor there who was teaching a 400 level class, so a senior level undergraduate class about North American ethnography. And I was in this like funny transition where I realized that what I was currently studying was not interesting to me and was not motivating me in what I wanted to do. And I was looking for something that was more science-based and also involved people. I knew what anthropology was, but I didn't really know how to make a career out of it. So I was fortunate enough to be written into this class as a freshman. Mind you, it was a huge learning curve for me because it was one of those classes where there were only 3 grades. It was a term paper, a midterm, and a final, and then there was one small extra credit opportunity. And I didn't do so great on the first test, but I ended up, being in the upper half of the class at the end because I was really, really interested in the coursework overall. And I realized about halfway through the course that almost everything that I had ever been taught about Native peoples was wrong. The information that I learned when I was a Boy Scout, most of it was wrong. The information I learned from the public school system that I went to here in the Cincinnati area, most of that information was wrong. And I also became disenfranchised with the idea that Native peoples don't exist. There was this perspective, this pervasive mentality amongst a lot of the early literature that I had looked at where it was kind of viewed in a chronological sense, where Native peoples kind of just fell off when you reach into the historic period. And I didn't think that made sense. So I really focused on ethnohistory, and I really was humbled by the fact that I could have been so unbelievably misinformed. And by the way, I went to a high school in this area that has a Native American name. Literally, the whole district has a Native American name. And the information that I learned there was incorrect. So I had this, I guess, epiphany where I realized that my whole world perspective regarding Native peoples in my own backyard, the area that I grew up in, was misinformed, and that a lot of the information that was being presented about Native peoples was extremely misguided. Now, I know most people, when they think of archaeology, they tend to think of ancient Mesoamerica, classical archaeology involving Greek and Roman or Egypt, and I had a really big interest in those too, but it wasn't until I realized how I could be so misinformed about the history of my own backyard that I realized that I was going to be a North American archaeologist, and that's what I wanted to focus on.
So for you, it was a really late realization. You and I went different paths. I started, I studied history and I ended up in marketing. You started marketing. You ended up more towards history, although that does bring up the question, do you consider yourself more of a historian or a scientist?
I tend to lean more towards historian myself, but archaeology is one of those really rare academic disciplines that has the ability to draw from multiple sciences and historical sources. So it's kind of the intermediary between history and science in some ways.
Because you mentioned a lot of scientific process and tools to do that, and I never see Indiana Jones use any of them. So,
well, Indiana Jones wasn't a great archaeologist. I'll be sure to point that out. Let's put it this way: when it comes to cultural objects, rarely do they belong in the museum. The people who know how to care for them best are the people who created them in the overwhelming majority of cases.
So you're saying Indiana Jones's entire philosophy was wrong?
It's a product of its time, but that's the type of behavior that hurt Native people. And cultures all around the world, collecting their cultural items, removing them from the place where they were meant to stay so that they can be housed in a museum by people who aren't familiar with the appropriate customs and the cultural background to actually maintain those and take care of those, that causes harm. And as much as I loved Indiana Jones growing up, I mean, I can't say that it wasn't a part of my formative years and something that helped influence me in the direction that I ended up pursuing as a career. It's important to acknowledge and to own that type of mentality, that type of behavior is not appropriate today in modern archaeology.
And we see a lot of that right now with museums about repatriating objects to cultures all over the world because a lot of European nations were colonial powers, and so they would bring objects back, and now descendants and those ancestors are trying to repatriate those, trying to get those back, and it becomes this thing where a culture who has taken those and put them on display feels like they're more entitled to them than to their ancestral owners, and we see that with Native objects here, that there's an effort to say, if it's not repatriation, it's what stories are you really telling, and whose voices are telling that story, because you talked about the history that you learned in school. It is skewed in a very, very particular way. It is Native history through a European or a white American lens, and how those Native individuals are either in the way, or they were a hindrance, or they were an adversary, or a side character. you know Thanksgiving's coming up, and we talk about pilgrims and Squanto and things like that, and those are the pervasive stories and images of Native people in the United States that we are really working against to give agency back to Native people, and to give them their voice back. Because if museums are not being truthful and diligent in how they're cataloging objects, it's just a mismatch. And how do you know what comes from where, and what the provenance of different things are? Do you find that to be an issue that's still prevalent in museums in America today?
I think it's an issue that's changing quite a bit, especially as there's a new generation of archaeologists who are trained to involve Native peoples in the decision-making process, and to also consider them as primary stakeholders in their own history. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge, too, that history is generally written by the victor. And a lot of Native American history has been extensively suppressed. A great example of that is the Trail of Tears. One of the things that I realized early on, I was taught the Trail of Tears in school as a high schooler, but I was only taught of it from a southeastern perspective. Well, Ohio is a Native word. Many places in Ohio have Native names. A Trail of Tears happened in Ohio too. It happened in Nebraska. It happened in lots of different places. It's not specific to the Southeast. And that suppression of Native history, it completely undermines the idea, and this is a fundamental component. Native history is American history. Native history is Ohio history. We can't appreciate history without considering their contributions to the historical record too. And history is one of those terms too that tends to overemphasize the written record, but there are different ways of relating history. There's different ways of organizing knowledge too. So there is obviously oral traditions and oral history, and that was the predominant mechanism that Native Americans used to relate information from one generation to the next. It works great. Telling stories and explaining information in ways that is relatable to the next generation, learning from your elders, is something that we still do today. But it was viewed as inferior to the written history. And there's a lot of problems when it comes to history and emphasizing nationalism associated with it. There's a narrative that comes along with history, and you're not getting the entire picture if you're only getting it from one perspective. To accurately account for history, you need a varied perspective, a spectrum of perspectives to inform the information that's not being predominantly distributed by, say, only white male Americans. There are a lot of other people that are Americans too, and their voices are just as important as the predominant stories that are told in our historical textbooks today.
How do you overcome that lack of resources, though, or lack of sources? So when you're talking about the Fort Ancient period, you're not necessarily recovering writings. You're dealing with tribes and communities that don't have a clear ancestry where those stories are being passed down. So how do you tell those stories when you don't have those literal stories to tell?
And a lot of those stories have been lost. You have to be honest with it because of governmental programs of forced assimilation, of boarding schools. There's a lot of things that our government did to make it so that tribes couldn't relate their own history, and they couldn't practice their own religions or their own cultures, at least publicly facing. So a lot of it ends up being through trust, working with tribes, building those relationships and listening to them and listening to what they have to say is a great place to start. When it comes to Ohio, the same, and this is the same in the Southeast, this is the same everywhere. The same Native American families that were removed from specific locations because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, those families still exist. Those families, they still exist in Oklahoma, they still exist in Michigan, they still exist in California, they still exist in New Mexico. Those same families still exist. Now, the information that may have come from their elders and may have been passed on generations, yeah, that might have been lost in some cases because of governmental programs to specifically separate that information from them and to strip their culture. But there's a lot of information that's still there. And by working with descendant communities and federally recognized tribes, that's another really important designation to make. There are a lot of, quote marks, tribes out there that are not really tribes. A tribe is a government. It is a community. It's a government. It's not an interest group. It's not a religion. It's not, a group that meets on Thursdays to play cards. A tribe in order to have received federal recognition, they had to have had a treaty with the United States government or one of the other colonizing European groups that was in North America during the 15, 16, 17, 1800s. So that's the only way that a tribe can be federally recognized, at least originally. There are some other mechanisms that can promote federal recognition today. And there are some state-recognized tribes, too, that are authentic. But there are a lot of groups out there that represent themselves as tribes that are not tribes. So it is very important to convey that when it comes to working with Native peoples, starting with the federally recognized groups is the only way to do it ethically and in a culturally appropriate manner, because those are the actual descendants of the people who were removing from areas. So there's a difference between having Native American ancestry and being a member of a federally recognized tribe.
I want to step outside of the professional realm briefly, because before we started recording, you were talking about trying to gather in your garden before the first. Was this the first frost of the?
I think we had a light frost a couple weeks ago. This is the first one that I wouldn't say it was a hard frost, but it made me nervous, so I harvested a lot of the stuff in my garden. Yes.
So what are you growing in your garden, and what are you doing with it?
I grow a lot of different things. So during the COVID shutdown, I basically graded my entire yard. I converted a significant portion of it into it's a vegetable garden. I do grow some native plants. So I grow sweetgrass. I grow white sage. These are both sacred medicines to several Native American communities, probably the vast majority. I grow a lot of food that I try to use to help offset what we have to purchase at the grocery store. It also minimizes my carbon footprint as a whole. So I grow lots of tomatoes, lots of green peppers, lots of spicy peppers, jalapenos, banana peppers, Anaheim peppers, those types of things. Spinach, Swiss chard, kale, lettuce, did green beans, okra. What else do we have? Asparagus. I'm going to expand a few things now. I have a young son right now, so I think next year we're going to be growing pumpkins in order to have the opportunity to carve our own jack-o'-lanterns from our own grown pumpkins at home.
That's very cool.
I grow squash too, but this year the squash beetles got me a little bit. I've had some problems with some invasive species in our area that have been pretty tough on certain types of plants. Army worms are one of them. I've grown potatoes before too. They didn't do so great this year. Squash beetles and potato beetles really kind of wiped out those two crops. I try to do it as organically as possible, which is anyone who's a gardener out there probably realizes that's really difficult to do. And certain things aren't really worth the space investment for growing. Like I don't do a lot of onions. I do grow garlic because it doesn't take up a lot of space and you get a pretty good production from it. But I don't know if I'll continue with potatoes because they take up a bit of space. They're a lot of extra work. They're a little bit harder to keep the pests off of. My forays into broccoli and cauliflower have been kind of similar too, where it just doesn't have the type of density that I would like for the vegetables that I would be consuming. I also live in an urban area too, so I have to be careful about where I plant things in my yard. So certain things I do plant in the front yard, but I'm cognizant and aware of how the exhaust from passing cars and buses and things go by, how that can impact certain plants. But long story short, what I do with it is we can a lot of it, we freeze a lot of it. I have a personal goal to never buy green peppers or bell peppers at all between the months of late July and hopefully December. So I'm really hoping it warms up a little bit longer so I can get a few more bell peppers out there. But I don't know if the ones that I have right now, which are more than I'd care to admit, I don't know if those will get me through December like I would generally hope.
How are you eating bell peppers that you're flying through them that much?
Well,
are you just snacking on bell peppers?
Well, we definitely do a lot of dips with them.
Yeah.
I like to, so one of the best ways I find for preserving them into the winter, and I had to buy a deep freeze to do this as part of, we finished our basement not that long ago. And in the process of finishing our basement, we realized that we had space for a deep freeze. So stuffed peppers is a great way. You can add peppers to just about anything. So lots of chili, lots of soups, lots of, I like to make fajitas, tacos. So lots of peppers and onions go in there. They tend to be a little bit on the heavy pepper and onion side. But there's a lot of other ways too, I guess, that we need to look into. In the past, we've made relishes with peppers, and I have a bunch of red jalapenos I'm hoping to make a red relish out of this year if the frost last night didn't hurt them too badly. But we're always interested to learn. I'm very fortunate that my wife is tolerant of my gardening and also is good at canning and working towards sustainable ways of trying to use as much of that produce as much throughout the year. And I mean, amongst many Native communities, food giving and gift giving is a important way of kind of solidifying relationships and establishing them. So we've made jams and jellies to give away. I like sharing food with my neighbors and things too. Not everybody has the time or the space to garden, so it's one of those things that it's just as rewarding to give it away as it is to produce and eat it on your own. This year, I think I'm going to have such a surplus of bell peppers that some of it is most likely going to end up at the Free Store Food Bank. And keep an eye out on the break tables here because there's probably going to be a bag of peppers at some point too, as I don't have time to eat them all.
Was there a learning curve for you when you started your garden,
Of
or
course.
have you done that? Did you do this growing up? Did your family do it growing up?
We have a long family history of sustainable gardening within our families. My grandfather, he was a very avid gardener, so a lot of the basic methods and timing of when to plant things, when to sow your seeds. I start everything from seed myself. I don't purchase seeds or plants. I have friends and family who will occasionally give me ones that they've bought at a store, but I start everything indoors. So I have a couple of windows that are really great for functioning as gardening windows. They let ultraviolet light pass through them to some degree, so it helps to germinate seeds. But yeah, it's something that as a family we have always done, and my sibling and my mother and a lot of my cousins, we all garden in some way.
Wow. Are you making salsa?
We do
you
a
have
lot of salsa over the
Do you?
summer. Yes, I don't really can salsa so much. We
you just
we
keep
do
that for yourself?
well. When it comes to the tomatoes, we have so many of them. This year we canned a lot of them into crushed tomatoes, and those will be great starts for soups. We made a bunch of tomato sauce. I think I have a couple of frozen bags of tomatoes right now that eventually I'm gonna turn into kind of like a rotel. So it'll be a pepper and tomato mix. So it'll be kind of a spicy crushed tomato type situation. We're hoping, so I'm on the recognition committee for the museum center, and we're hoping to bring back our chili cook-off, which it's been since probably 2015 or 2016 since we had that
It's
last.
been a while. I won twice.
Did you?
I won twice, 2 years in a row. And I don't know if we stopped after that or what, but yeah, it was chili cook-off was great
One of my favorites.
because you got to try everyone else's chili,
Mhm.
and then food service internally would make Cincinnati style chili, so you could get your three-way and your coney and all that stuff. But you get to try everyone's cooking, and everyone has their own recipe and things like that. So it's sort of fun to see people just trying something new and throwing that out there versus people who this is my dad's recipe, which he got from his mom, and on and on and on. To see those recipes passed on. But food-based events are awesome because
It's a cultural universal. It's a way
Yeah.
for all types of people to build relationships. And I have a terrible time following a recipe. I kind of just wing it as I go along. It's the way I was taught to cook, and most of the time it works out really well. But for an event like that, it does require a little bit of pre-planning and making sure that the information for the recipe is available for those who might have food allergens. And out of all of the chili cook-offs that we've had, I remember so many different categories. There were, non-traditional ones. I remember very specifically there was a year where it was a curry chili that was really, really, really good.
Interesting.
Of course, there were vegetarian ones. There was the Cincinnati chili recipe. I remember there was the Noah's Ark chili one year where it had like 11 or 12 different types of meat in it that we're really lucky to have Jungle Jim's in Cincinnati. So the person who made that, I know who he is. He's still here at the museum. That was one of my favorites, even if it was really salty, because some of them were basically beef jerky or whatever the meat was. But that's one of my favorite events that we've ever had at the museum for a staff gathering.
We just jumped right into it. When did you start at the museum? When did you join?
I was an intern starting in late 2008. And I started as a staff member working in the Natural History and Science Museum starting in 2009. So I've been with the museum collectively as an unpaid intern and as a staff member for almost 15 years.
Wow, that's incredible. When did you move because you moved from the Museum of Natural History and Science to the Geyer Center in the archaeology department. Right, when was that change for you?
That was a part of the transition of getting prepared for the major restoration of Union Terminal. So I worked as floor staff in developing programs and interpreting a lot of the ologies, archaeology, paleontology, mineralogy, geology, for visitors coming to the Natural History and Science Museum from 2009 until 2016. And then starting in July of 2016, which was about a year and a half, 2 years or so after I finished my graduate degree, focusing on Midwestern archaeology, I transitioned from at the time it was the education staff, the Natural History and Science education staff, to the archaeology department and curatorial personnel.
Do you ever miss getting that frequent interaction with guests now that you're behind the scenes, which is really really interesting and really fun about doing this podcast, is being able to pull more of the behind the scenes up front for people, because there's a whole world that people don't see. But do you miss it?
Of course, there's a lot that I miss. There's some things that I don't miss, but I do miss a lot of the kind of serendipitous conversations that you have with people who are just passing through, who aren't from Cincinnati originally. I do miss working and relating a lot of the information about the exhibits to individuals, and also just having free time to wander around in the exhibits. As much as I love my job and there's not anything I'd change about it, there are opportunities to be more public facing. The Layers event coming up this Friday is a great example of that. I'll be there along with my boss, Bob Genheimer, the George Rivas Show Curator of Archaeology. We'll be there working to highlight some of the information in our area, especially the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. We'll be bringing some collection items, and we'll be discussing a gallery space that is going to be turned into a indigenous focused exhibit about the peoples who have called Cincinnati home since time immemorial.
A lot of work still to be done on that, but a really incredible gallery that's going to do a lot of really wonderful storytelling about the process and the people as well. That'll be great. Everyone stay tuned for that. Before we kick you out of here, I have to ask the question: if you could change roles for a day with anyone in the museum, who would you change roles with?
Well, let's see. I don't have a lot of interest in being in any administrative roles. I have a lot of responsibilities in administering our lab and working with volunteers and interns, but I think a day of working back on the Natural History and Science Museum, maybe in the STEM classroom, would be a fun day. We have a really great STEM staff, and the engagement personnel at the Museum Center is top notch. I haven't had an opportunity to go through the Create Culinary Gallery yet, but I do love cooking, so I could definitely get into trouble in there. That would be a lot of fun too, but it's so new, I'm not even really sure if that were going to be my one day wish of where I would spend time. It could be. It very well could be. And I heard that there's some really nice chef coats to go along with some of the people that are working in there too.
It's a pretty slick space. Yeah. It's kind of a culinary laboratory. And as you were talking about food as gifts and what they mean to different cultures, and we even talked about it with the chili cook-off and how that's a way of using your grandma's recipe as a way of passing your personal culture onto someone else. That's another part of the Create Culinary Studio, which is really exciting for people to be able to get into and to introduce a different way to educate people and for people to learn. And as you mentioned, anytime you throw food in there, it's a pretty good time.
Yeah, and for me, my wife and I, we both have different responsibilities. I do most of the cooking, and she does a lot of the cleaning up. And she does a lot of the baking, and then I do a lot of the cleaning up. So a day in the Create Studio and cooking, as long as somebody were there to help clean up afterwards, that would make it even more amenable to my cooking style, I guess.
Restaurants listening, that's a really smart idea. And let people come in, let them cook in your kitchen, and just clean up after them. Mm-hmm. That's one of the hardest parts, is doing the shopping and cleaning up afterwards.
I'm so OCD about it. I hate having dishes there, so sometimes I get a little grumpy when it takes longer than I would prefer for things to get cleaned up a bit. So make sure that there's a little bit of expediency in there too. It just, a kitchen should be clean at times, but it also should be dirty at times.
You mentioned, you're not a new dad anymore, relatively. Your son's almost 1, right?
Yeah, he's 11 months.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's
time
amazing.
flies. Yeah, nothing has shown me how fast time goes than watching him grow up.
You look surprisingly well rested. Good for you.
I wouldn't say that. But we've been fortunate in although we don't ever get a complete night of sleep, full 8 hours, I get enough sleep.
Fair enough. Well, Tyler, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for listening to Meanwhile at the Museum. Remember, if you like what you heard, please rate and subscribe. But more importantly, come see for yourself. Visit cincymuseum.org to see the latest reasons to visit. If you have any questions, comments, or just want to tell us how much you love the show, send us an email at meanwhile@cincymuseum.org. Thanks for listening.